It is an odd thing that someone like myself, who hates to dress up, got into a profession where dressing up seems to be part of it. And people always have some sort of opinion on whether or not I am appropriately dressed. And those opinions vary. How many of you like me better this way? Go ahead, raise your hand. Okay, all right, well, that's, like I said, I don't, so we'll go back. But it's a strange thing that there have been times in history when a pastor just simply could not have the job without being clean shaven. And there have been times in history where a pastor simply could not have the job without wearing a beard. The robe and the stole and all those other pieces of clothing that come with it, which are just too warm to wear in the winter, in the summertime, are all part of that. I've talked about the stole that I sometimes wear. I meant to bring it in here today and put it on to remind you of it, but I left it in my office. The stole that I wear, you know what I'm talking about, the multicolored thing. Does anybody remember what I said it is symbolic of, the stole? Yeah, my sister-in-law gave it to me, but it is symbolic of wearing a yoke. It is supposed to represent that you are wearing the yoke of Christ. Now, what's a yoke? That wooden piece on the oxen there is a yoke. It's a device that is used to help draft animals, like oxen or horses or donkeys, to pull a load efficiently. It's usually made of wood. It goes over the shoulders and neck of the animal and enables the animal to pull the heavy load with its most powerful muscles of its neck, its shoulders, and its chest. It is also designed so that the animals, if there are more than one, obviously they have to pull together. They can't go one ahead of the other. They have to pull together, and that's part of its purpose too. This would have been a very common sight in Jesus' time. They would have had many times where they would have seen someone working with a yoke. Has anybody here ever worked with a yoke? Anyone? Becky? Yeah, you've seen them, but oh, you have, Horace? Yeah, okay. Yeah, they're still in use today. They still are used, but in Jesus' time it would have been very common to see it. It is typical in our tradition, our church tradition, for a new pastor to be given a stole placed over his shoulders in the same position that a yoke is placed on, essentially, as a sign of being in the service of Christ. Now, the yoke is mentioned in the Bible a lot of times. I looked it up. I don't know how many times, but it's in there all over the place. Of course it is. It would be common in their time. But it's usually a metaphor for being oppressed, being forced, being some kind of a slave. A nation might conquer another nation and talk about placing their yoke on this other country. It was a sign of slavery. In fact, did you know that they built yokes for human slaves, that they were designed to carry, to be attached to human beings to hold them together as well? In this passage that we read today, Jesus says that the yoke he places on us is easy. But who even wants to wear an easy yoke? Who even wants to put on one that's easy? You remember Bishop Desmond Tutu, one of his most famous statements? We don't want our chains made more comfortable. We want our chains removed. So you could ask that question, why would anyone want to wear a yoke of any kind? A yoke is a loss of freedom. Why would anybody want that? Well, the fact is, we do it all the time. We put yokes on ourselves all the time. We form partnerships of all kinds, formal and informal. We have to do it. It's necessary to human life for us to find some way to work together. If nothing else, it allows us to get the work done that we have to do. The ox is able to pull efficiently because of the yoke and plow the field that will then be planted with the food that the ox is going to later eat. The yoke enables us to work side by side. So when churches put together committees and organizations and structures, the idea of it is it's a yoke. It enables us to work side by side, to pull in the same direction. It makes us efficient. Families are yokes, aren't they? You find all of a sudden one day that you look over and there you are yoked with somebody else and you can't pull off and do your own thing? Families are yokes. It's necessary to human life. Now, the most famous story of a yoke in the Bible is this story from the life of ancient Israel. Rehoboam, I don't know if that's him or not, but I picture it like that. Rehoboam was the son of Solomon, and Solomon was the third of the three great kings of ancient Israel. And Solomon was known for what? Being wise, his wisdom. That is true. They say he was quite wise. Solomon was wise, and he built his country up into its very most powerful state. But he wasn't so wise that he didn't know better than to use people as slaves to do it. He conscripted his own people into forced labor to build the buildings and military installations and serve in the military. And when he finally died, the story tells us that his son Rehoboam becomes king, and the people gather and say to him, now look, Solomon was a great king, but he put a heavy yoke on us. He forced us into slavery, basically. We'll serve you if you put a lighter yoke on us than your father did. And Rehoboam, clearly not as wise as his father, has to think about it. How hard was a decision to make? Whether the question was, should I treat them as harshly as my father did, or should I give them a break? That's what they wanted. They wanted a break, and he had to think about it for 3 days. And when he finally came back, he said to them, you think my father was tough? My little finger is thicker around than my father's waist. He beat you with whips. I'll beat you with scorpions. I don't know really what that means. Does he tie scorpions onto the ends of the whips? I don't know. But whatever it is, it doesn't sound like a good thing to me. And when Rehoboam announced to the people that he was going to be even tougher and make a heavier yoke than his father did, what do you think happened next? I'm taking it for granted that I'm the only one who knows the Bible well enough to know, but maybe I'm wrong about that. What happened after Rehoboam said this? You can guess. Yes, the people revolted. They split the country in half, and from then on, you read the story of the history of Israel, the part that broke away, and the kingdom of Judah, the part that stayed under the reign of Solomon's descendants. He split the nation right in half because he was determined to be so tough. Then along comes Jesus, who makes this statement that we read today. Come to me, you who carry heavy loads. Take on my yoke, for my yoke is easy. My burden is light. Well, again, I ask, who wants to be yoked? And we can also ask, why is Jesus talking about yokes at all, which are seen in the Bible as symbols of slavery? Well, the reason for that is, first of all, as I said, there's no getting through life without putting on a yoke. I often hear people complaining about other people who are on public assistance of some sort, people who are getting some sort of public assistance, and the complaint often includes this: nobody helped me when I was coming along, so why should I have to pay to help somebody else? Is that true? Is it true that you can make it in this life without getting help from somewhere else? How many of you were born able to get up and work and cook and feed yourself the day you were born? Nobody? Elena, you at least, right? No? How many of you went to a public school, drove on a public road, had a fire department in your town, or a police department, or a military that you watched? How many of you ate food that had been carefully inspected to make sure it was safe? Did anybody get anywhere without being yoked to somebody else? No, it's not possible. It's just not possible. But in another sense, you are a being who needs to be yoked. We human beings have a deep desire to be connected to be bound up to something that is greater than ourselves. There is no such thing, I say, as a non-religious person. Everyone has a sense of something that is larger than themselves that they find themselves tied to. And we're not always good about figuring out what that is. Sometimes we think it's money or sex or power or alcohol or whatever. But we are all in the service of something. We are all pulling a yoke. Do you remember the famous poet that said this? You might like to wear cotton, you might like to wear silk. You might like to drink whiskey, you might like to drink milk. You might like to eat caviar, you might like to eat bread. You may be sleeping on the floor or sleeping in a king-size bed, but you're going to have to serve somebody. Yes, indeed, you're going to have to serve somebody. Well, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you are going to have to serve somebody. Who is that? Okay, you all know. Good. You know Bob Dylan. You don't know Rehoboam. Okay. Yeah, you got to serve somebody, but it doesn't have to be that guy. All right? You have to serve somebody, but you don't have to serve Rehoboam. What troubled Jesus was the spiritual yokes that people of his time were trying to carry around. And maybe that doesn't sound like a big deal to you. Maslow put that as the last thing that we need on his hierarchy of needs, but really, your spiritual needs are the underpinning of everything else that happens in your life. It's where you begin. And Jesus saw that the people around him were carrying a heavy spiritual load. Many of the people of Jesus' time thought of God as judge, and that God's primary concern was to catch us doing something wrong and punish us for it. That was the way they looked at life. God was a lawgiver primarily, and it was almost impossible to keep the law, and breaking it meant punishment or even death, and it was a fearful way people had of looking at God. And they thought of God also as exclusive, as favoring one people over another. So they looked at everyone else with suspicion. Every day the question was, are you one of them or are you one of us? It fostered a hatred of others that they had to carry around with them, a fear and a suspicion of others that was part of their daily lives. And that hate became so much a part of their lives, that hatred of the others and the hatred of a God that they feared, well, the only result of that is self-hatred as well. And that is the load Jesus saw people carrying. And it's just like that today still for a lot of people. A lot of people in the world look out at life with guilt or fear or hatred. Many Christians in our world today are hostile to Muslims, and many Muslims are hostile to Christians right back. In the world in which I was raised, everything was evaluated by theology. If somebody didn't agree with us on matters of theology, well then we just couldn't have anything to do with them. And I just knew for sure that if God was watching me, that God was displeased with me. I was certain of that. Religion was really, for me, a matter of wondering whether I was on the right side of the line or on the wrong side. Being afraid of others, carrying a load of guilt, being afraid of God, that's a hard way to live. That's a heavy load to carry. Jesus sees people carrying that heavy yoke, and he says, come to me, and rest, for my yoke is easy, my burden is light. The yoke of Christ, of course, is love. And that may lead you to some tough fields to plow, but it doesn't carry that heavy load of guilt or fear or hate. Can you imagine that heavy weight lifted off of you? Look out at the world around you with hope and love instead of fear and guilt. See people who are different and just say, they're different. Jesus says, come to me. Live my way. Be filled with grace, with hope, with life. That's the yoke that I'm asking you to carry, a life that is filled with grace and hope and life. Yoked with Jesus, I can live like that. I told some of you this story. This happened to me Monday. Was it Monday or Tuesday? I was just back from vacation. I was over at Hannaford, stopped in to buy something healthy to eat. And I was back in my car driving away through the parking lot, and two young women walked past in front of me. I made the assumption that they were Somalian women because they had dark skin and they wore those long, colorful robes that many of the Somalian citizens around here wear. And they walked past in front of me, and I just stopped and let them go in front of me. And coming towards me, also on foot, was an older man. I would have to say a white man. I don't know what else to describe it, a little scruffy looking. And he caught my eye, And then he looked over at the two Somalian girls who were walking away from him, and he went like this. And then looked back at me to see if I agreed with him. I'm not speechless often. And everybody that talks to me about this later on says, well, what did you say to him, knowing me? But cars behind me, I drove on, I gave him a disgusted look, but I've been thinking about it ever since. And you know what I think? I think how awful to be that man, to carry that load around with him. Two young, harmless girls, just talking as girls do as they walk along. And he hates them for that. Is that a yoke you want to carry? I don't. And the good news of the gospel is that is not the yoke Jesus asks us to bear. Not a yoke of hatred for others, or for God, or for ourselves, but a yoke of peace and love and hope. And I can carry that yoke. Will you join me in that? Amen.
You've been listening to a sermon by Reverend Stephen Carnahan, pastor of High Street Congregational Church in Auburn, Maine. If you feel inspired by what you hear, we invite you to join us in person for worship services every Sunday morning, beginning at 10 o'clock. Of course, you can always listen to Steve's sermons on the web. New sermons are posted every Monday by midday. Please take a moment to explore this website for more information about our church, or visit our Facebook page at High Street Congregational Church, UCC. We hope that God's presence will be known to you every hour of every day, and that God's blessings will rest upon you now and always. See you next week.